Here's background. Thank you, and good morning to all. It's a beautiful day down here in Southeast Wisconsin, and I think it maybe is across the state. So spring is finally here. And we wanted to share a presentation from Jason Cavadini on managing our nutrients in our pastures. So I am Kirsten Jersick with Glacierland RC&D. Dang, Jack. I just wanted to do a quick introduction on Glacierland RC&D. So Glacierland RC&D was established in 1995, so been around for quite a while. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we are part of the statewide and national RC&D networks. So the work we do, most of you know us is our grazing work, but we do multiple use forestry work. We do a lot of invasive species work, and then a lot of different regenerative agricultural work. And our grazing networks and grazing works falls under the regenerative agricultural work. In addition to our grazing work, we have several conservationists, resource conservationists that work throughout eastern Wisconsin. So these are our cooperative conservation staff shown on the right. They work out of NRCS and county land and water offices. So for our on-farm regenerative agricultural grazing services, as many of you know, but for those of you don't, we provide on-farm technical assistance to farmers. We write site-specific grazing plans or just give them consults and without full grazing plans. We work with our farmers to evaluate cost share opportunities for implementing grazing practices. We're developing new grazing networks now, and we host pasture walks and workshops across eastern Wisconsin. And if you can see the map on the right-hand side, our staff work in all of those counties. Kelsey Wallish focuses mostly in our northeast region, and I focus mostly in our southeast region. And Jack and Mike work in all those regions with Kelsey and I. So I would like to give a shout out and a welcome to Kelsey Wallish. She's our newest grazing team specialist, and again is working in those northeastern counties. And this is our grazing team at Glacierland RC&D. So Kelsey, Jack, Mike, and myself, and our contact is right there. If anybody has questions for us or needs any follow-up help on farm technical assistance, please reach out to myself or Kelsey and let us know, and we'll make sure we get you helped. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jason Cavadini. Jason is our Wisconsin UW Extension grazing specialist for the state. I've had the pleasure of working with Jason for maybe about the last year now. And we started getting a lot of questions about, hey, what should I be putting on my pastures for nutrient? And it just kind of made me think, let's have Jason give a presentation on this so we can all learn together. So again, if you can all please mute yourselves so that we're not having background noise, and turn cameras on during the presentation, we'd appreciate it. If you're unsure how to mute yourself, it should be in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You should see a mute. And then when you do mute yourself, you will see a little red on your screen by your name so that you are muted. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining. This presentation, Jason's slide presentation, should take about 40 to 45 minutes. We do ask that we hold all questions till the end of the presentation so that it's not distracting for viewers that are watching the recorded session. I'll turn it to you, Jason. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kirsten, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's also a very lovely day here in north central Wisconsin. Did a little working on fence this morning, and the turkeys are gobbling. So it's that time of the year, but it's also the time of year to be thinking about various parts of improving our grazing systems. And we've had several opportunities over the winter months to talk about soil fertility and pastures, and it's a topic that has been pretty well received, and every time we've taken it somewhere else, we've had a pretty good response and lots of questions. So we kind of realize that this is a topic that has been maybe overlooked a little more in the past few years than some other topics. So we're going to talk about pasture soil fertility and then a little bit about pasture renovation as well. And just as a reminder, if you could help out by muting yourself, that would be helpful. So to start this conversation, I'd like to just take a step back and talk about soil health for a minute. And the reason I'm going to talk about soil health just for a minute is because that's really been something that almost every workshop, every conference over the winter and for the last few years, soil health has been a topic that comes up frequently, and it's kind of come full circle. It's a topic that used to be received with mixed emotions, and occasionally we'd see farmers' eyes glaze over when we talk about soil health, and now it's a practice that has been fully embraced for the large part, and we see a lot of watershed groups around the state now with farmers who are enthusiastically pursuing the principles of soil health. So just as a reminder for anyone who doesn't know the principles of soil health, there's 5 of them. Keep the soil covered, minimize soil disturbance, maximize diversity of crops on the land, continuous living roots on the land as much as possible, and integrate livestock. So one way that I like to view the principles of soil health is to take that list on the previous slide and to flip it. And so the first couple of them here on the bottom are what I view as kind of your easier entry points into soil health or soil conservation practices. So keeping the soil covered and minimizing disturbance. So that would be like no-till planting, getting cover crops in when we can, having some perennials in the rotation. And as we move up this ladder, every step we take, every rung on the ladder, we're increasing in complexity of implementation and also in the amount of return that we get for that practice, and livestock integration is on the top. So the reason I show it like this is because as we move up the ladder, it's more difficult to implement these practices, but there's more to be gained by doing it. And we really cannot reach the full potential of soil health without climbing all the way to the top. So as we've talked about this, there's a lot of farmers who have been more than willing to check off those first 4 boxes, but oftentimes it's that 5th one that seems to be going just a little too far. And so that begs the question, what about that 5th principle? By choosing to not implement that 5th principle, are we choosing to plead the 5th? Are we ignoring what could be gained? Are we potentially leaving something on the table? And so I'm not trying to be witty with this, but I really am just trying to ask the question, what are you leaving on the table by just choosing to not put any livestock on the land? And maybe on a more positive way of looking at it, what could be gained on your farm by putting a few animals back onto the land? And so that's really the premise of these conversations about grazing is how far can we take soil health by having livestock on the land? So just this is kind of more big picture before we dive into the specifics of soil fertility and pasture renovation, but there really are some larger opportunities for grazing in Wisconsin. So if you look at the impact of grazing, there's about 10 million acres of cropland in Wisconsin and 1 million acres of pasture land. We know that on that cropland, there's at least about 10% of the acres that there could be a better use for. In other words, there's a practice that we're kind of forcing a fit on those acres. And oftentimes grazing is a practice that works well on those acres because it is done on a perennial forage base. And as we know, or as I talked about, we cannot achieve the greatest level of soil health without those livestock. So grazing has potential on those acres, but we also know that there's a good percentage of pastures that are already out there. So that 1 million acres of pasture land that currently exists, there's a large chunk of that can be improved. So when we look at the opportunities that we have, so integrating livestock into cropping systems can really help to elevate soil health. Dairy heifer grazing is something that we're putting a lot of effort toward. Transitioning and beginning farmers, there's opportunities that grazing allows for those farmers, but the big one is how can we improve current grazing operations? And so that's kind of what the rest of this talk is going to be about, is a couple ways of improving systems where grazing is already taking place. So myself as a grazing outreach specialist and many other grazing specialists around the state will often get questions from farmers, something to the tune of, how can I get more forage in my pastures? How can I get a better forage? How can I get better grass? How can I graze longer in the season? And then what's interesting is that's the initial question, but then the farmer will often follow that up with questions that are geared toward solutions that require spending money. What seed should I buy? How much fertilizer should I apply? Or should I replant my pasture? So all of those require time and money. So then I'll respond with questions right back to them. Have you soil sampled? What kind of grass do you have? How many acres are you grazing and how many head are on those acres? And really, if you boil it all down, the question is, what's your management? And all of this needs to come back to management. So we can come up with all different kinds of solutions, but if the management isn't there, nothing really is going to be a lasting solution. And it's important to understand that when we use the term pasture, not all pastures are the same. So they differentiate largely by management. So it can be continuous stocking or managed grazing or some intensity in between. It could be a pure grass stand or a grass legume mix. And there could be harvesting or no harvesting. And all of those things really influence what kind of pasture we're talking about. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about managed grazing, which is basically controlling the timing, density, and intensity of grazing by managing the movement of livestock across the land accordingly. So what makes managed grazing different than other types of grazing? What makes pastures under managed grazing different than other pastures? Well, the first would be leaving behind 4 to 6 inches of residual post grazing. So we're never taking everything. This would be like the take half, leave half logic. A 30 to 40 day rotation. So significant periods of rest for that forage. Utilizing a grass legume mix, not always. There are some farmers who do prefer a pure grass mix, but that's going to most likely be a scenario where they've got nutrients available on the farm, like a manure source or something like that. Some farmers do prefer that, but generally speaking, we like to see a grass legume mix because of the fertility implications that the legumes have. Utilizing cutting and clipping to manage the forage quality through the season. Grazing for a short duration, so having them in one spot and moving them on relatively quickly. A high stocking density on that portion that's being grazed, but a low stocking rate on the farm, which allows all of this other stuff to work. All of these go toward an extended grazing season. So that basically means whatever the potential is, like for however long we can graze, maximizing that as much as possible and finding ways to stretch that out a little more every year. And and using other methods of building fertility, such as outwintering on pasture. When all of these things are applied, managed grazing maximizes the forage yield, the quality, the grazing season, that livestock integration component. So as we talk about how important that is for soil health, it managed grazing gives us the ability to maximize that. Ecosystem services, that's a fancy term that's been coming up more and more lately, but it's basically like how society values what we're doing. So we talked about that soil health part, or the impacts on soil and water quality. And when we're able to start seeing how that, or what kind of value that has for society and the communities around us and the environment around us, that's ecosystem services. And then profit margin, which is what it all comes down to. So managed grazing is a practice that I talk about as one of very few in agriculture that works everywhere. And Wisconsin is an extremely variable state from one border to the other. There really are very few practices that we can say work uniformly. And if there are any, one of them would be managed grazing. Now, managed grazing in the Northwoods is going to have some different nuance than managed grazing in the southern part of the state. But that being said, managed grazing as a practice can work pretty much across the entire state. And why that happens is grass physiology, which is a fancy way of saying because of the way grass is, and livestock integration. So here's one data set that shows what I mean by livestock integration. So what this is showing is the livestock, plant, and soil interaction that takes place through grazing. So this is two measures of basically how there's several different ways of measuring how healthy soil is. These two here are looking at soil biology. So these are two measures of how healthy a soil is. So if you just picture a 40-acre field of a perennial forage that's established, that you cut in half, and one half of it you graze it with, let's say, dairy heifers, the other half of it you harvest it. The only difference between those is one half had equipment on it, the other half was grazed with livestock. And then after that season, you measure microbial respiration and biomass carbon. You guys have significantly more of each of those where you were grazing, as opposed to where you harvested mechanically. So what that's highlighting is the fact that grazing stimulates soil biology and improves soil health in ways that harvesting cannot do. So we could have all of our other soil health principles in place and just hitting it out of the park. But by not putting those livestock on the field, we're not able to get to that top rung of the ladder. And that's what's happening here. So what this is telling us is livestock are the missing link. So I've said plenty about that. But the reason I've talked quite a bit about that is, what does that mean? Once we get all of these things in place and we have a well-managed grazing system, so we have all of those principles of managed grazing in place. Now, what kind of implications does that have for soil fertility? In a well-managed grazing system, it's really a complete recycling system where up to about 80% of nutrients are being recycled back into the soil. So how does that impact soil fertility? So when we talk about soil fertility, we have to understand that it's not independent of soil health. So we've talked a lot about soil health over the last few years, and maybe haven't talked as much about soil fertility, but they're not really interchangeable. They're not independent of each other, but they're also not interchangeable. They go together. So soil fertility is not really straightforward for all pastures. So that's what I'm going to go into now, is just how to maybe tweak our thinking a little bit in a well-managed grazing system. So in Wisconsin, our soil fertility guidelines are based solely on this A2809 publication. This can be downloaded for free at this web address here. But this really isn't taking into account a very well managed grazing system. So this is a very good basis to start off of. But then what I want to help you think about is how to maybe tweak it or build off of that. So I'm not saying that this isn't relevant, but I'm saying this is maybe the starting point, but it's maybe not the ending point. This second publication here, A4034, can help move you a little more in the direction of grazing, but this is more of just a general pasture guideline and not necessarily well-managed grazing. And then this document here is just another supplementary, kind of goes along with these. This is more of a classic, timeless publication for rotational or managed grazing. So let's just go to the basics real quick. The next 2 slides, I'm going to just cover the basics of soil fertility. I won't spend too much time, but the goal is to maintain an adequate supply of nutrients to support economically optimal yield and quality while minimizing environmental impact. There's 17 essential nutrients. We're going to talk about the big ones that get all of the attention, N, P, and K. You can sometimes benefit from these, especially sulfur, especially boron in forages. But I would just say that you should know that you're short on these. Validate it with sampling. So if you see deficiency symptoms, or even if you don't, maybe you want to take a tissue test at some point during the season to check for some of these micronutrients. And if the tissue test indicates you might be short, then maybe validate that with a soil test. In a routine soil test, you'll get nitrogen will not be on that, and I'll explain why in a minute, but you'll have phosphorus and potassium, pH, and organic matter. You can pay a little extra to get secondary and micronutrients, but like I said, I would only do that if you're seeing deficiency symptoms, or if you took a tissue test and it's indicating that. The recommendations that you get back on a soil test report are going to depend on your soil type, the crop that you put in there, along with the yield goal, and then other inputs. So this isn't necessarily going to be on the soil report, not all of this. And so I'm going to help you think through that here in a minute. So your soil report, depending on what lab you go to, is going to look something like this. It's going to have P and K and pH, and it's going to tell you if you're in the optimal range or above or below it. So you need to know this information to really get moving in the right direction with soil fertility in your pasture. This is kind of the basis. And then if your soil pH is not imbalanced, then anything else you do for N, P, and K really isn't gonna be worth the expense, because pH is driving the ability of taking those up for plants to take that up. So if you do need to adjust soil pH, you're looking at a range of about 6.0 for grasses, 6.3 for legumes. There is quite a range there for pasture crops, more than a lot of other crops. But if you have to address it, since you're not using tillage to incorporate it, the recommendation is to not exceed more than 4 tons of lime per acre. So nitrogen, we're not going to spend a long time on, and that is because if we're recommending a grass legume mix, it's often not recommended, and I'll explain that more. But the thing to understand about nitrogen, applying it to the soil, it's very mobile and it's very short-lived, and that's why it's not in a routine soil test, because what's there the day you sample it might not be there, probably won't be there by the time you get your results back. It's really most critical if you don't have legumes in your pasture, but it can be detrimental to legumes because it'll give the grasses a competitive edge, and they'll basically outcompete the legumes, and the legumes will disappear. It's mostly beneficial in harvest scenarios, and it mostly benefits only the next harvesting event, whether that's cutting or grazing. In a pure grass stand, it needs about 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre, split no more than 40 or 50 pounds at a time over a season. but it's not recommended where you have legumes in the stand. Phosphorus moves with soil particles, but if the pasture is established, that hopefully isn't very big worry. If we're making hay, we're removing about 15 pounds of phosphorus per acre. If we're grazing only, we're still removing about 3 pounds per acre. But this often isn't the first priority because a lot of grazing is happening where there's been a history of livestock. If there hasn't been a livestock history there, then maybe phosphorus is something worth looking at. But if there has been, it may not be the most economical. Potassium is the big one. This is the one that could be overlooked pretty easily. It's not very mobile, but it's extremely critical to legume persistence. About 150 pounds per acre are removed from a hay crop in a given season. Especially if you take 2 cuttings, you're going to remove about 150 pounds. Still about 30 pounds are removed from just grazing alone with no hay taking place. So it's needed occasionally where grazing occurs, and it's recommended annually where hay is made. So that's the basics. Now I'm going to go into sort of advanced soil fertility and a well-managed grazing system. So in a well-managed system, we have lots of things happening. We have things coming into the soil and things leaving the system. And it's constantly, we have imports and exports, fertilizer, manure, legumes. We kind of have to take stock of what we have to really dial in what we want to spend our money on if we're going to apply fertilizer. So here's what a pasture with about 15 to 25% legumes needs in a given year, according to the recommendations. So you can see what we have going in, and we've got 80% of nutrients recycling as well. And you can see what we have leaving if we're making hay and if we're selling animals on the market or selling animals as meat. So here's how that comes out. If we're only grazing, and we have 15 to 25% legumes, we're creating a surplus of nitrogen. And we're coming a little bit short in P and K. Now, like I said, in some situations, we can get by for a while without thinking too much about phosphorus, because that's not a real big issue if we've had a history of livestock. But now if we add haymaking in, we're really expediting the process. We're mining potassium. And I just took this a step further using this year's current fertilizer prices. That'd be about $180 per acre to replace these nutrients. But what's further complicating things is we sometimes feed on pasture. We sometimes make hay. So it's also important to know what we have when we make hay. So I'm a huge advocate for sampling hay, number one, because we want to know the quality that we're feeding our livestock. If we are really short, we can come up with a plan for making up for that. But also, we can use this to know how much, as far as nutrients, we're removing from the soil with our hay. So the phosphorus and potassium are right on there. And here's a little calculation you can use. Nitrogen's not on here, but crude protein is on here. So you can convert crude protein over to nitrogen to know how much nitrogen you're removing from the soil just by taking your pounds of dry matter in that bale times the percent crude protein and dividing it by this number here. And you end up with knowing how much is in a bale. So 765 pounds of dry matter and about a 950 pound bale. You have 18 pounds of N, 3 pounds of P, and 24 pounds of K. So that bale is worth $24 alone just in N, P, and K. So we have this complete recycling system, and really what this is highlighting is the link between nitrogen and potassium and legumes. And I think this is, for nutrient management, this is what I would like the take-home point to be, is, again, if you don't have legumes, you need 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But where you do have legumes, you don't necessarily need any. Potassium is critical to those legumes being there, and you're removing it at pretty high rates, even with grazing. So potassium really has a significant role here. Potassium is actually part of our nitrogen program as well. And I'll conclude that thought at the end of the presentation here. But for a minute, I want to talk about renovation. And the reason why I want to talk about that is it's the time of the year to be thinking about that, but it also has a significant role in keeping those legumes in the pasture. So there's really 4 scenarios for renovating. So after outwintering or after pastures that have been damaged, and that would be like, say you have early spring grazing and you get a significant rainfall and part of the pasture really gets beat up. It's in some cases it may need to be renovated, but outwintering is normally what we're talking about. Mismanaged or overgrazed pastures, a poor quality forage base. Someone might just start out with a pasture that just wasn't good in the first place, or what I've been talking about and what you see in this picture here is the end of the season. You can see wherever the legumes exist, you have nice green grass, but where they don't, where there's nitrogen deficiencies. So basically, when you start dialing in what kind of renovation approach you're going to go with, you have a variety of options that depend on the timing of year that you're looking at. So we're right here right now. We're probably past frost seeding now. Last week was probably the last opportunity for most of the state. But really, all these things that I talked about, I won't go too much into detail because I'm getting short on time, but all of these influence our renovation approach as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but here's 5 scenarios that kind of take us in the direction that we're going to end up in for renovating. So if we've got an outwinter damaged pasture that we want to return to quality pasture, there's multiple approaches, but we can no-till drill that area or we can broadcast it later on. If we have a good quality grass and thinning legumes, and we just want to fill that in and maintain legumes, we can prepare that area by grazing it late in the fall and frost seeding the next spring. That's going to work with clovers pretty confidently. Grasses, it's going to be tougher. If we have a good quality grass with thinning grass and legumes, and our goal is to thicken it with grass and legumes, we can prepare that area by grazing in the late fall, and we can no-till drill it with a grass clover mix, but there must be some bare spots. You want to use grasses with similar palatability. You don't want to have a poor quality grass and try to fill it in with a very good quality grass, because that'll get overgrazed and thinned out in a hurry. If you have poor quality grass that's patchy and you want to transition that to a better quality, you're going to graze it tighter than you're normally comfortable with in the fall, and then in the spring frost seed it or no-till drill it, and sometimes do both of those until it's successful. But it's really important that you need to have exposed ground, about 50%, less than 50% density of plants for that to happen. And then lastly, if you have a really poor quality, a very thick like sod grass, that'd be like brome grass or bluegrass, reed canary, quack grass, this may be a time where you're looking at complete renovation. I know I went through those really fast, and I am getting down there to the end, so I know we're getting tight on time, but I've got just a couple slides left here. There are a couple advanced renovation methods. So frost drilling, that could be about this time of year, although now with the weather and the forecast, we might be past that. But that's basically like the timing you'd be looking at broadcasting or frost seeding using a drill instead. And really what that achieves is you can get more uniform coverage than you would maybe broadcasting. Late summer interseeding can happen when a late summer new seeding would happen. You would graze it before seeding and no-till drill grass legume mix into the stand, and then continue grazing that until you see those seeds emerge, and then take the animals off of it. And every once in a while, this really takes a high level of management. But if you want to completely renovate without spraying or tilling, you would graze it tight late in the season and no-till drill it during the dormant season. And that may take multiple efforts as well. I'm going to skip over that one there. And I've got just a couple slides left here on legumes, maintaining legumes. This just shows a couple different methods of getting red clover into an established pasture, with frost seeding having the highest success rate. And the reason for that is not because it works better, but because of the timing. It happens about a month earlier. But it's important to know that even where the most successful attempt took place, only about 33% of those seeds become established plants. And what that does is, where you have pure grass or you have legumes interseeded into the grass, you have 38% more nitrogen in that grass, which leads to 35% higher forage quality. So those legumes are playing a significant role. And so that's why we talk about that for renovating. So to bring all this down to the take-home message, so here's one approach for soil fertility in a managed grazing system. You're basically managing potassium to manage nitrogen. So where you don't have potassium, you're not going to see the legumes. And where you don't have legumes, then you're not going to have nitrogen, and then you're not going to have anything grow. If you won't see the grass either. So a way to approach this is, if you make hay, you want to replace that potassium at removal rates. If you don't make hay, then you can get by with replacing the potassium occasionally. And then a big one is to interseed clover on about a third of acres each year, just to keep those in the stand. Then my last slide here is just something that Kirsten asked me to touch on as we're starting to look toward grazing season now. So here is a slide I skipped over previously. This is the cool season perennials. This is just from last season. This is the potential of these in dry matter yield. So we can push 4.5 to 5 tons of dry matter per acre, but we can only achieve that with best management. If we overgraze one time, this is what this graph here is showing, overgrazing down to a 2-inch residual in October, that is depressing the yield the entire next grazing season by 25%, which then decreases our stocking rate on the entire farm by 26%. So when we take only 50% and we graze it down to a 6-inch residual, 4 to 6 inches, all of the sunlight, all of the energy captured from the sun by that residual is going toward above ground regrowth. But once we begin taking more than 70% and we only leave 30% of residual behind, now everything being captured from the sun is going toward restoring the roots below ground, and it's stalling above ground growth for up to 17 days. And that's even more when we take it down to, if it's a 10-inch plant, we take it down to 1 inch, 100% of growth is stalled for 17 days. So we're really depressing yield by not leaving proper residual. So as I finish, I just want a real quick plug for this survey that is taking place for Green Lands, Blue Waters. It's called the Match Made in Heaven survey. Getting livestock back on cropland. And this is really driving future efforts for outreach and research and programming. And we would really appreciate anyone who would be willing to sign on and take this survey. with that, that is the extent of my presentation, and I will be able to take questions. And I'll leave these slides up just in case any questions need me to revisit a slide.
Thank you so much, Jason. Fantastic presentation, and great reminders for us as we start the grazing season this year. Does anybody have any specific questions for Jason? You can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute your microphone and turn on your camera, or you can raise your hand. Well, if not seeing any, I'm going to ask a few myself to get us started here. Jason, when you were talking about the amount of P&K we need to put back on our pastures for either haying or grazing, what about a situation where we take our soil sample and our soil's really depleted? So, you know, we're getting numbers back that are in the very low range for the nutrient needs of that pasture. Should we be adding correction before we do our initial seeding? Can you touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, so I think it's really going to depend on how low it is, but often those new seedings can get started with, I don't always think that it has to be addressed before seeding. Those seedings can get started if we are below optimal, but it's more of for persistence through winter is the big role that potassium plays, for example. And so I think once that crop is established, that's when we really want to focus on the fertility. But I guess on the other hand, if it's low enough, because of the expense of what it takes to build the soil back up, I think no one's going to want to do all of that at once. And so maybe in that case, it would make sense to put on a little bit before seeding, and then wait to put some more on after it's established. I think that's what my recommendation would be.
Thank you.
And I'll just say that this really, I mean, the starting point is to just figure out where you're at, and then to just sit down and kind of pencil things out and decide, you know, if you're getting good, if you soil sample your pasture and you find out that you're low in potassium, but you've been very happy with your production, well, then it is going to be harder to justify putting, you know, spending a lot of money on that fertilizer input. And so the farmer does have to weigh all of those things, and I'm very cognizant of that. But I think the thing that I'd like people to think about is left addressed for a long time, it can compound and end up costing, you know, more money to correct it later on. So it's just something to think about before it's a really big problem, I guess.
Yeah, we have a question in the chat, Jason. I don't know if you want to address it or if I should.
I can't see the chat as I'm sharing my screen. So
okay,
maybe I can.
So we have a question in the chat regarding grazing height. And do we have different grazing height recommendations for different types of livestock? So for example, sheep, followed by chickens, followed by beef cattle. And so I'll start on that and I'll let Jason chime in. So the grass height is going to be the same for any species we're grazing. So when we're rotationally grazing, we're managing the livestock, the forage, and the soils all at the same time. And so that grazing height is really important to keep it at the 4 to 6 inch residual level, because that's how we're managing those grasses. And then there was a question about adding native warm season grasses and forbs. So what we've seen is if we try to introduce those into our existing cool season pastures, the cool season grasses usually take over and outcompete them. So the native warm season grasses and forbs would be their own seeding in their own paddock, and that would be most appropriate. And I'll let, in their grazing height will probably be a little bit higher. The grazing height of any species depends on the growth tip of that plant. And I'll throw it over to Jason to add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, you answered that really well. I would say that the 4 to 6 inches is kind of across the board. And that's more based on I guess, the physiology of grasses, especially cool season grasses, and what they need to remain productive through the year. So I think those are, so that's the same across the board. It does also have implications for parasite control and stuff like that as well. So if we stay above 4 inches, that's really helping with that as well. And then, yeah, as far as the warm seasons and the natives, I definitely recommend treating those as a whole separate thing and as basically as a niche, timing wise. So.
Also, Jack just informed me that he had turned your cameras off, and I'm not sure if he muted you as well during the presentation, but he's having a hard time turning y'all back on. So if you can go ahead yourself on the bottom left-hand side of your screen and turn your videos back on and unmute yourself so you can ask a question, please do so. And if that's not working, if someone could throw it in the chat, we'd appreciate it.
And I actually can see the chat now. So I see Katie's question. When needing to apply K, do you recommend spreading a portion throughout the season similar to nitrogen or all at once, if all at once in the spring? So actually with K, so this is another thing where it goes back to the farmer preference and just being cognizant of costs and stuff like that. So I'm going to just speak personally as a farmer here, but I'm going to do it in one shot because I don't have, I'm going to be hiring someone to apply it, and I don't want to have to hire someone to apply it twice. So I'm going to just put it on all at one shot. And what I normally do is wait till after a harvest event. So whether we made hay or grazed at once, that's when I'm going to do it.
And why are you picking that time after your first cutting of hay or first graze, Jason?
Because I just feel that that's when everything as far as the plant uptake and the soil biology and everything is running at its peak. And I just feel that it's the best, the best system for getting all of that incorporated, and the best timing for getting that all incorporated into the system. So, but again, that's a farmer preference thing. That's what works the best for me. I guess there's, if I think about it, that's probably the first, if before the first grazing, I don't think I would want equipment going across my pasture because we tend to be moist here, and I don't, want to damage the pasture at all. And so that's kind of my logic as well, I guess. Yeah, so I see the comment there about 20 to 30% of your grazing acres to be native warm season grasses, forbs, and legumes. I agree with that. The only thing I'd say is I think the native warm season grasses, people's management needs to be there before I'm comfortable recommending that. So what I recommend to people is don't shoot for 20 to 30% all in one shot. Maybe take it in pieces and ramp up toward that. I don't know if everyone agrees with that or not, but I think just from my experience with warm season natives and also seeing other people's experiences with them, I think the management has to be there. And so I think ramping up to that is something that I'm more comfortable with recommending. So
Yeah, I also want to throw out there, somebody had asked about worm season grass research. I just want to let you all know you will be on our mailing list since you've registered for this webinar. And on June 28th, we will be having a worm season grass pasture walk. We'll be looking at the quantity and quality of the worm season grasses that Ryan Heinen has planted at Gwinnett Hills Farm, and that is in Waukesha County. So we'll be doing a twilight pasture walk on June 28th at Gwinnett Hills, addressing grazing worm season grasses, and then the pollinator benefits of them as well.
Yeah, and one thing I'll throw out there is I actually recently read the book by Patrick Kaiser, Keyser, from University of Tennessee, called Native Grass Forages for the Eastern US. And I've felt that that's one of the best resources I've come across for grazing natives. It's very practical, and I found it very helpful. So yeah, the question there about the research. So that is the topic on of native prairie grasses. It's constant chatter. There's more and more interest in it all the time, and we're well aware of the fact that any information we can get is better than what we have now. And so that's something that's on the radar of several of us, and I would expect information to be coming out within the next couple of years, and also to have some research being conducted on that as well. So I think the hardest thing is it's doing research on cool season grasses takes a little time, because you have to establish it and then wait till it's established to collect the data. And then doing grazing research on cool season grasses takes even a little bit longer, but now doing grazing research on native grasses is going to be even longer. So it is, to get scientific data is definitely a goal, but it'll take a little bit of time.
Another question I just had, Jason, was what is I think you and I have had these conversations before, but what is your favorite time of year to renovate existing pastures to try to see those grasses establish?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll apologize. I realize I went through that way faster, probably twice as fast as I should have. But for renovating, so it depends. I still, if we're just talking legumes, keeping legumes in the stand, I still prefer frost seeding, just because the timing seems to be the best. And I could be speaking solely in terms of my environment here in north central Wisconsin. So obviously somewhere where moisture is limiting because of soil type, so in the sandier soils, now we're talking something different. But in parts of the state where the soil can hold moisture, I still think frost seeding is a really good option, because it's more accessible for a lot of farmers, and it's just the timing of it seems to work out. We get ahead of those grasses. But if we're talking something more than legumes, I really like late summer seeding, especially if we're talking establishing a brand new pasture or just starting a pasture over. I like late summer because the weed pressure is so much less than any other time of year. Obviously moisture is going to be a factor there as well. But that's what the most successful pasture establishments I've seen have been in late summer.
Thank you.
Are there any forbs or legumes that would mine nutrients deeper in the soil profile and bring them to the surface? Some of those do. So like plantain is an example, but I know that there's people with other experiences, but I've worked with plantain quite a bit, and I've struggled to get it to last through the winter. it's just been a challenge here. We've had very beautiful stands of it. We actually have one at the research station right now, and I'm waiting to see how that comes through. So I guess that's the best answer I can give on that. They definitely, if we could get them to remain, could be super beneficial, but I think that's been the challenge for a lot of those.
And so that's interesting. The research station is in central Wisconsin, right, Jason? So you're a little further north than at least us in southeast Wisconsin, where we have seen that persist. So,
So you do see some of those forbs persist better.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
might just because we're a little bit warmer. But
Oh, that's so Andy's question, what's been the most successful talking point to get farmers to switch to managed grazing? That is interesting, could be an interesting conversation. That trying to figure out how I even want to answer that. It's so let me use the heifer grazing of dairy farms just as a quick example, but like, we can show the environmental and the economic benefits of it, and we can show examples that it's been successful, but there's still perceptions that putting animals back on the land is taking a step backwards. Part of that is because it looks like taking a step backwards. It's what generations, it's what they did several generations ago. And so really what we're trying to show now is that this grazing isn't the grazing that you think of when you hear the word grazing. So that's really what we're trying to do. But I would say the perception that it's just not as productive is probably the biggest barrier. And then I would say the other thing is the people who are already grazing, it's still not intuitive for people. The whole rest and rotation and residual thing is just not intuitive. It's very hard to talk about that with farmers and actually have it translate to what they practice in the field. So let's see.
there was a chat, wouldn't proper pH be the first thing to address for fertility? And Jason did specifically say that.
Yep. I see. Thank you, Sherry, for putting the link there. Have you been able to test for improved quality and forage with better grazing management practices? So yeah, that's basically what we're doing with all of our so I'll just go back to the cool season grasses and legumes, for example. Showing that data set where I showed the yield potential, we're doing the same thing with quality. So we already know that these grasses that often, or grass legume mixes that often get promoted for grazing, we know that they can achieve very high, I mean, we're talking lactating cow quality forage. So we have that information, and we're also building that data set to show how residual height affects that as far as yield over the entirety of the season and quality as well.
Bluetooth mode. Connected.
Steve Kastner, I think you're not muted. But do we have any other questions for Jason? Well, seeing none come in, I think you've helped us a lot, Jason. Super appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And for those of you who are getting ready to embark on the next grazing season, I wish you all the best of grazing.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we're in a few weeks out from maybe getting some animals out on pasture in southeast Wisconsin. So look forward to it all. And we also will be sending our pasture walk schedule out in the next week or two. So meanwhile, if anybody has anything they need help with, feel free to give Kelsey or I a shout out. And again, thank you very much, Jason.
No problem. Take care.